There's a sentence that shows up in one form or another across almost every major Stoic text that survives in the ancient world. And if you actually stop and take it seriously instead of letting it slide past as a nice-sounding platitude, it should genuinely unsettle you. The sentence, roughly, is this: nothing outside of you can actually harm you. Not the insult, not the diagnosis, not the betrayal, not even, according to the most extreme versions of this claim, death itself. Only your own judgment about these things has the power to harm you, and judgment, unlike the external event itself, is something you author. The first time most people hear this idea stated plainly, the reaction is something close to offense. It can sound, on first contact, like a philosophy written by someone who has never actually suffered, someone insulated enough from real loss to entertain such a comfortable, detached theory from a safe distance. And yet the three men most responsible for preserving and developing this exact idea were, by any honest measure, among the least insulated people of their era. Epictetus spent a significant portion of his life enslaved, his body at another person's disposal, and by some ancient accounts walked with a permanent limp caused by mistreatment during that period. Seneca spent years in exile, stripped of his position, his reputation, and his access to the people he loved, before eventually being ordered, later in life, to take his own life on suspicion of conspiracy he may not have even been meaningfully involved in. Marcus Aurelius spent nearly 2 decades as emperor fighting wars he never wanted, managing a devastating plague that killed enormous numbers of his own people, and burying several of his own children, a kind of grief that needs no elaboration for anyone who has experienced anything close to it. These were not comfortable men theorizing from a garden. These were men who had every conceivable reason to believe that the world could, in fact, harm them profoundly, and who nonetheless arrived, independently and through direct hard experience, at the claim that the deepest kind of harm was never actually located in the events themselves. So before dismissing this idea as naive, it's worth asking what these particular men, who had lived through slavery, exile, plague, and the death of their own children, could possibly have meant by it, because they clearly weren't claiming that pain doesn't exist, that grief isn't real, that loss doesn't hurt. They were making a much more specific, much more surgical claim, and understanding that precision is the entire key to why this idea, once it actually lands, tends to change how a person moves through the rest of their life. Let's start with what the claim is not, because clearing away the misunderstanding is most of the work here. The claim is not that external events are pleasant, or that Stoics are indifferent to what happens to them, or that a wise person should feel nothing when their house burns down or when someone they love dies. That version of Stoicism is a caricature, and it's worth saying clearly that none of the major Stoic writers actually taught it. Seneca wrote consoling letters to grieving friends that are full of genuine tenderness and acknowledgement of real pain, not cold dismissal of it. Marcus Aurelius's private journal contains passages that clearly wrestle with frustration, with the difficulty of dealing with people who annoy him, with the sheer exhausting weight of his responsibilities. Hardly the writing of a man who has achieved total indifference to his circumstances. Whatever this claim about harm actually means, it does not mean don't feel anything. What it does mean requires understanding a distinction the Stoics drew between 2 categories of things, what they called externals, meaning anything outside your own mind and will, your body, your possessions, your reputation, other people's opinions of you, the outcomes of events, and what they called your own ruling faculty or judgment, meaning the part of you that interprets, evaluates, and assigns meaning to everything that happens to those externals. The core claim, stripped down to its most basic form, is that externals themselves are morally neutral, neither good nor bad in themselves, and that whatever moral quality an event ends up having in your actual lived experience gets added entirely by your own judgment about it, not by the event itself. This sounds abstract until you test it against something concrete. So let's test it. Consider losing a job. Losing a job is, by any conventional measure, treated as an unambiguously bad thing, something to be feared and avoided. But notice something interesting if you look closely at how differently people actually experience the exact same event. One person loses a job and experiences it as a catastrophe, a verdict on their worth, an unbearable public humiliation, something that colors every subsequent month of their life with anxiety and shame. Another person, losing the exact same job under nearly identical circumstances, experiences it as a difficult but survivable setback, even in some cases, as an unexpected opening towards something better, a forced correction they might never have made on their own. The event itself, loss of employment, was identical in both cases. What differed entirely was the judgment layered on top of it, the story each person told themselves about what the job loss meant, what it said about them, what it implied about their future. The Stoic argument is that this difference in outcome, sometimes catastrophic suffering, sometimes manageable difficulty, from an identical external event, is proof of the underlying claim. If the job loss itself were the actual source of harm, it would produce roughly equivalent suffering in everyone who experienced it. The way touching a genuinely hot stove produces roughly equivalent pain in every hand that touches it regardless of whose hand it is. But suffering from loss doesn't behave that way. It varies enormously based on interpretation, expectation, prior belief, and meaning-making, which strongly suggests that whatever is actually producing the suffering is happening inside the judgment, not inside the raw event. This is where Epictetus' teaching becomes especially sharp and especially useful, because he pushed this idea further than almost anyone else in the tradition, into territory that remains genuinely difficult even for people who consider themselves fairly convinced by the basic argument. Epictetus taught that even a person's own body, something that feels about as intimately you as anything could possibly feel, belongs technically to the category of externals, things not fully within your control, and therefore not the true location of either your good or your harm. This is not a claim that physical pain isn't real, or that Epictetus, walker with a permanently damaged leg for much of his adult life, was somehow unaware that bodies can genuinely suffer. It's a claim about where your sense of your own worth, your own flourishing, your own identity should ultimately be anchored. If you anchor your sense of self entirely in your body's condition, in your health, your appearance, your physical capability, then every illness, every injury, every sign of aging becomes an assault on your actual identity, not just an inconvenience to be managed. If instead your sense of self is anchored in your judgment, your character, your choices, which remain entirely within your control regardless of what happens to your body, then physical difficulty remains genuinely difficult, genuinely worth managing and addressing, but stops being an existential threat to who you actually are. There's a specific teaching device Epictetus used repeatedly with his students that's worth walking through carefully, because it gets at exactly how this claim is supposed to work in practice rather than just in theory. He would point out that an insult, someone calling you a fool, for example, has no power on its own to actually harm you. The words themselves are just sound waves, vibrations in the air, entirely without the capacity to physically touch you in any way. What actually produces the sting of an insult, in Epictetus' analysis, is your own judgment agreeing with it, at least partially, or fearing that others might agree with it, or caring enough about the speaker's opinion that their words carry weight in your own internal sense of worth. Change any of those variables, and the exact same sound waves produce an entirely different result. If a young child calls you a fool, most adults feel nothing at all, not because the insult was somehow less severe in its content, but because the adult's judgment doesn't grant the child's opinion any real authority over their sense of self. The words are identical in both cases. The harm exists only where the judgment allows it to exist. This distinction matters enormously in modern life, arguably more now than at almost any point in history, because we live inside systems specifically engineered to convince us that external validation and external threat are the primary currencies of a worthwhile life. Social media rewards you, in very literal, quantifiable, dopamine-triggering ways, for accumulating positive external judgment, likes, followers, comments, and punishes you in equally literal and immediate ways for accumulating negative external judgment, criticism, mockery, public disagreement. The entire architecture of these systems is built around training you to locate your sense of worth outside yourself, in the shifting, unpredictable, often manufactured opinions of strangers, which are precisely the opposite of where the Stoics argued your actual worth and actual vulnerability to harm should be located. Let's take this claim and apply it directly to something almost everyone has experienced: receiving harsh criticism, whether from a boss, a stranger online, a family member, or anyone whose opinion happens to carry weight for you. The immediate, automatic experience of criticism, for most people, feels identical to the experience of an actual physical threat. Your heart rate increases. Your stomach tightens. Some part of your nervous system responds as though you were in genuine danger, even though, in almost all realistic cases, nothing about your physical safety is actually at stake. Epictetus's framework offers a genuinely useful way of examining this reaction rather than simply being carried along by it. The criticism itself, the actual words spoken or written, cannot touch you physically. What produces a felt sense of injury is entirely the meaning you assign to those words, whether you interpret them as an accurate assessment worth taking seriously, an inaccurate assessment not worth much weight at all, or, in the most damaging interpretation, a verdict on your fundamental worth as a person, which is a leap the words themselves never actually justified, no matter how harshly they were delivered. This doesn't mean all criticism should simply be dismissed or ignored, and it's worth being precise here, because there's a lazy misreading of Stoicism that turns this into nothing anyone says about you matters, ever. That's not the claim. Some criticism is accurate and useful, and a wise person, in the Stoic framework, actively wants accurate information about their own flaws and mistakes, because that information is genuinely useful for the project of improving their own judgment and character over time, which is the one thing fully within their control. The claim is narrower and more precise than blanket dismissal. It's that the emotional injury you feel from criticism is not an automatic, unavoidable consequence of the words themselves, but a separate, examinable step that you have more influence over than it typically feels like in the heat of the moment. You can absorb the useful content of criticism, adjust your behavior accordingly, and decline to treat the delivery of that criticism, however harsh, as evidence about your fundamental worth as a human being. Those are two genuinely separable things, even though they arrive bundled together and feel, in the moment, impossible to pull apart. Marcus Aurelius offers a particularly useful angle on this same idea, because unlike Epictetus, who was teaching mostly in the abstract to students who came to hear him speak, Marcus was working through his philosophy under the direct, daily pressure of running an empire, dealing constantly with people whose opinions genuinely could affect enormous outcomes, senators, generals, foreign leaders, whose judgment of him was not some abstract philosophical exercise, but a matter of real political consequence. Marcus's private writings show him repeatedly returning to a specific refrain, that his task was never control what other people thought of him, an impossible task in any case, but to ensure that his own actions were, as best he could determine, genuinely good and genuinely aligned with reason, regardless of how those actions were received or interpreted by others. If his actions were sound, then external disapproval, however loud, however politically inconvenient, was ultimately not a verdict on him, but simply a fact about the limitations or biases of the people disapproving. This is a subtle but crucial shift in where a person locates their sense of security. Instead of needing the world's approval to feel secure in who you are, which makes your entire sense of self hostage to forces completely outside your control, you locate that security in the ongoing, private project to try and act well, according to your own best judgment. A project that remains entirely within your control regardless of how the world responds to it. It's worth pausing here to address the single hardest test case for this entire philosophy, the one that pushes a claim to its absolute limit, and that the Stoics themselves treated with the most seriousness: death, both the death of people you love and the prospect of your own. If nothing outside you can actually harm you, does that mean death isn't actually bad? This is where philosophy requires its most careful handling, because a sloppy version of this claim can sound almost monstrous. A philosophy that tells grieving people their grief is somehow a mistake, a failure of proper judgment. That was not the actual Stoic position, and it's worth being precise about what they did claim instead. The Stoics distinguish between what they call preferred indifference, things like health, life itself, the continued presence of people you love, which are not strictly necessary for virtue, and therefore not classified as the ultimate good, but which are nonetheless entirely reasonable and natural to prefer, to work to protect, and to grieve when lost. This is a more sophisticated position than simple indifference. A Stoic is not required to pretend that losing someone they love feels the same as losing a set of keys. The natural human response to loss, grief, sadness, a period of mourning, was treated by most Stoic writers as an appropriate, even necessary, part of being a feeling human being rather than a purely rational calculating machine. What the philosophy actually argues against is not grief itself, but a specific, additional layer that often gets attached to grief. The belief that the loss represents some kind of cosmic injustice, a violation of how things are supposed to go, a permanent, unrecoverable wound to your own capacity for a good life going forward. Marcus Aurelius, who buried multiple children over the course of his life, a tragedy almost unimaginable by modern standards of child mortality, wrote about death repeatedly not as something to be falsely minimized, but as something to be expected, prepared for, and integrated into a realistic understanding of what it actually means to be a mortal creature living among other mortal creatures. His argument was never, don't grieve. His argument was closer to, grieve honestly, but don't compound that grief with the additional, avoidable suffering of believing the universe has specifically wronged you by doing something that was, in fact, always going to happen to every single person who has ever lived, without exception, since the beginning of human history. This distinction between the raw, natural pain of loss and the additional, self-generated suffering of treating that loss as a personal injustice is genuinely useful in ordinary life, while outside the extreme case of death. Think about any disappointment you've experienced where the actual event was painful enough on its own, but where you noticed, honestly, that a significant portion of your suffering came from a specific, additional thought, this shouldn't be happening to me, or I don't deserve this, or everyone else has it easier than I do. These additional thoughts are not neutral descriptions of reality. They are judgments, exactly the kind of judgment Epictetus was pointing to, and they are, in a very real and testable sense, optional. The disappointment itself might be unavoidable. The specific, additional narrative of cosmic unfairness layered on top of it is something you're constructing in real time, and constructing it always seems to make the actual felt experience of suffering measurably worse, not better. There's a practical technique that flows directly out of this understanding, one that several Stoic writers describe in slightly different forms, but that amounts to the same underlying move, separating your description of an event from your evaluation of it. Try this the next time something difficult happens. Describe the event to yourself in the flattest, most neutral language you can manage, the way a court stenographer might record it, without any adjectives, without any moral verdict attached. Not, my co-worker humiliated me in front of everyone, but my co-worker made a critical comment about my work during a meeting with other people present. Notice how much of the emotional charge in the first version comes from words like humiliated, a judgment, rather than from the actual neutral facts of what occurred. This is not a trick to pretend the event was pleasant. It's a genuine exercise in noticing exactly how much interpretive work your own mind is doing automatically and mostly invisibly on top of the raw facts, and how much of your actual suffering is coming from that interpretive layer rather than from the facts themselves. This same technique scales up to much larger events, though it requires considerably more practice and honesty to apply at scale. A serious medical diagnosis, described neutrally, might be, My doctor found evidence of a condition that will require treatment and some changes to how I live. Described with the evaluative layer fully attached. It might become, my life is over. Everything I plan is ruined. I have been robbed of my future. Both descriptions might be responding to the exact same set of medical facts, but only one of them is actually supported by those facts alone. The other is a story, a prediction, a catastrophic narrative that is left far ahead of what is actually known. And while that narrative might occasionally turn out to be accurate, it is, at the moment it's constructed, an act of interpretation rather than an act of simple observation. And interpretations, unlike facts, are genuinely within your power to examine, question, and sometimes revise. None of this is meant to suggest that this practice is easy, or that simply understanding the theory makes the actual felt experience of pain disappear on command. It doesn't, and no honest reading of the Stoic text suggests it should. What the theory offers instead is something more modest and, in the long run, more useful. A genuine reason to pause before fully accepting your first automatic interpretation of a difficult event as though it were simply an objective fact about reality, rather than one possible reading among several. This pause doesn't eliminate difficulty. It creates room to ask whether the specific flavor of suffering you're experiencing is coming entirely from the event itself, which may genuinely be difficult and worth taking seriously, or partly from an additional layer of catastrophic interpretation that you have more influence over than it initially feels like you do. There's a version of this idea that shows up constantly in modern psychology, though usually without any acknowledgement of its ancient roots, in the cognitive model of emotion that underlies most contemporary therapeutic approaches to anxiety and depression. The basic claim in that framework, that emotional responses are generated not directly by events but by the thoughts and interpretations a person has about those events, and that change in interpretation can genuinely change the emotional outcome even when the event itself cannot be changed, is essentially a clinical, empirically tested restatement of exactly what Epictetus was teaching 2,000 years earlier to Roman students sitting on wooden benches. This convergence is worth noting not because it proves the ancient philosophy was right in some final, unquestionable sense, but because it suggests the core insight has been independently rediscovered by very different traditions, working with very different tools, separated by nearly 2 millennia, which is usually a decent sign that a piece of psychological wisdom is pointing at something genuinely real about how human minds actually work, rather than simply reflecting the particular. Cultural assumptions of any one era. There's a specific historical episode from Epictetus's own teaching that illustrates this principle in a way that's worth walking through slowly, because it shows the idea being applied not to some hypothetical minor inconvenience, but to a genuinely severe situation. Epictetus taught that exile, being forcibly removed from your home, your city, your entire social world, was one of the situations his students feared most, ranking it in most people's minds somewhere close to death itself in terms of severity. And yet Epictetus pointed out something almost mischievous about this fear. Exile, defined plainly and without the emotional weight typically attached to it, simply means living somewhere other than the specific place you currently live. That's the entire neutral content of the event. Everything else, the sense of loss, the shame, the feeling of being punished or diminished, is added by judgment, by attachment to a specific location, as though it were essential to your identity and your capacity for a good life, rather than simply one place among many where a reasonably good life might be built. He would point out, somewhat provocatively, that the actual physical world does not become meaningfully worse the moment you cross a political boundary. The sun still rises. Food can still be grown or bought. Friendships can still be built. Perhaps not the exact same friendships you had before, but friendships nonetheless. What genuinely changes in exile is not the fundamental availability of a decent human life, but your own judgment about what a decent human life requires, and specifically whether it requires remaining in one particular place with one particular set of people. This teaching becomes considerably more interesting and considerably more credible Once you know that Epictetus himself was eventually exiled, along with all other philosophers, from Rome by imperial decree, and that he responded to this exile not by treating it as a personal catastrophe, but by simply relocating and continuing to teach, eventually building one of the most respected schools of philosophy in the ancient world in a completely different city. He was not merely theorizing about how a person should respond to exile from a position of safety. He lived the exact test case his own philosophy predicted he would face, and by every available account, he met it with something close to the equanimity his teaching promised was possible. This doesn't prove the philosophy correct in some absolute sense, since one man's response to one instance of hardship is not a controlled experiment. But it does at least demonstrate that the claim wasn't purely theoretical, offered by someone who had never tested whether his own ideas could survive contact with real difficulty. It's worth taking a moment here to sit with one specific quote, attributed to Epictetus in a collection of his teachings recorded by his student Arian, because unpacking it carefully reveals just how much precision is packed into a very short statement. The teaching, paraphrased rather than quoted at length here since the surviving Greek has been translated many different ways by many different scholars, holds that it is not events themselves that disturb people, but rather the opinions people form about those events. On its surface, this sounds like a fairly simple restatement of everything already discussed. But look closer at the specific word choice, disturb, rather than something stronger like harm or destroy. Epictetus is not claiming that judgment is the only thing that produces any effect on a person's experience at all. He's making a more precise claim about the specific mechanism of psychological disturbance, the agitation, anxiety, and suffering that most people assume is an automatic, unavoidable byproduct of difficult external circumstances. His claim is that this particular kind of disturbance, the mental and emotional turbulence that so often accompanies hardship, is not actually manufactured by the hardship itself, but by the layer of opinion a person constructs about it. This is a testable, specific claim, not a vague piece of comfort, and it's precisely because it's testable that it holds up so well under scrutiny, since almost anyone who examines their own reactions honestly can find real examples in their own life where identical circumstances, encountered on different days or in different moods, produce wildly different levels of disturbance, which strongly suggests the disturbance was never fully determined by the circumstance alone. Let's bring this down to a specific, very ordinary modern scenario and trace it through in detail, because seeing mechanics up close tends to be more convincing than hearing the theory described only in the abstract. Picture someone who has spent months preparing for a major presentation at work, something they genuinely care about, tied to a project they've invested real effort and identity into. The presentation goes poorly, not catastrophically, but noticeably poorly. Questions they couldn't answer well, a visible lack of enthusiasm from a room, a boss who looks distracted rather than impressed. The raw event here is fairly contained. A presentation that did not land as hoped on one specific afternoon, in one specific room, in front of one specific set of people. Now notice what typically happens next, in the hours and days that follow, and how much of what happens next is actually generated by the mind rather than by anything additional occurring in the external world. The person begins replaying the moment repeatedly, each replay adding a slightly harsher interpretation than the last. The initial thought, "That didn't go as well as I'd hoped," gradually mutates into "everyone in that room now thinks I'm incompetent," which mutates further into "this is probably going to affect my next promotion," which mutates further still into "maybe I'm simply not cut out for this kind of work at all." Notice that at no point in this entire escalating sequence did any new external information actually arrive. Nobody came back into the room and confirmed any of these expanding claims. The entire cascade happened inside the person's own judgment, each layer building on the last, entirely disconnected from any additional evidence beyond the original, much narrower fact. One presentation did not go as well as hoped. This is exactly the mechanism the Stoics were pointing to, and exactly why their solution focuses so heavily on catching and examining judgment rather than trying to control or prevent difficult external events, which is often simply not possible. The presentation genuinely could have gone better. That part is real and worth examining honestly for the sake of future improvement. But the entire secondary cascade, the leap from one presentation went poorly to I am fundamentally incompetent, is not a fact anyone confirmed. It is a story constructed rapidly and almost invisibly, and it is precisely the kind of story a person can learn to catch partway through its construction, the same way you might catch yourself mid-sentence and choose different words. If you practice noticing when it's happening, the practical technique for interrupting this cascade is not complicated, though it does take real repetition before it starts to feel natural rather than forced. It involves, essentially, going back to the neutral description exercise mentioned earlier, but applying it specifically at the moment you notice a judgment beginning to expand beyond what the actual evidence supports. When the thought arrives, everyone in that room now thinks I'm incompetent. The useful move is to ask, plainly and honestly, what is the actual evidence for this specific claim, separate from the feeling that accompanies it? In almost every case, on close examination, the evidence turns out to be thin, a few distracted expressions, which should have a dozen explanations having nothing to do with your competence. A handful of tough questions, which are a normal feature of any serious presentation, not a verdict on your abilities. The feeling of humiliation is real and worth acknowledging, but the specific factual claim the feeling has attached itself to, everyone now thinks I'm incompetent, is usually a leap the actual evidence never fully supported, and naming that gap explicitly tends to drain a surprising amount of power out of the spiraling narrative, even when it doesn't eliminate the original, more modest disappointment entirely. It's worth being honest about the limits of this practice, because overselling it would be dishonest to exactly the kind of person likely to actually try it. This technique does not work instantly, and it does not work every time, particularly during periods of genuine exhaustion, or when a person is dealing with cumulative stress that has already worn down their capacity for this kind of careful, deliberate examination. Seneca himself acknowledged in his letters that even advanced students of philosophy continue to experience the initial flash of disturbance when something difficult happens, an involuntary, almost reflexive reaction that no amount of philosophical training fully eliminates. What philosophy offers in his account is not immunity from that first flash, but increased capacity to prevent that first flash from being endorsed and expanded into something much larger and more damaging than the original event actually warranted. This distinction matters because it sets a realistic, achievable goal rather than an impossible standard of never feeling disturbed at all. The goal was never become a person who feels nothing. The goal was to become a person whose feelings are not automatically trusted as accurate reports about reality, and who has built enough practice at questioning those feelings that the gap between the first flash and the final, settled judgment gradually widens over time. There's one more dimension of this idea worth exploring, because it addresses a question that tends to come up naturally once someone has sat with this philosophy for a while. If judgment is really where all the actual harm gets constructed, does that mean external circumstances don't matter at all? That a person living in genuine poverty or facing genuine danger is somehow equally well positioned as a person living in comfort and safety, as long as their judgment is sound? This is a serious objection, and it deserves a serious answer rather than a dismissive one. The Stoics were not claiming that external circumstances are entirely irrelevant to a good life, and it would be a distortion of their actual teaching to suggest they believe poverty and danger carry no real weight. What they were claiming is narrower, that a person's virtue, their capacity for wisdom, courage, justice, and self-control remains available to them regardless of their external circumstances, and that this capacity, not the circumstances themselves, is the actual foundation of a genuinely good life. A person facing real poverty faces real, serious difficulty, and the Stoics never pretended otherwise. Seneca wrote extensively and practically about the genuine challenges of poverty, exile, and physical suffering, treating them as real problems worth working hard to solve or mitigate wherever possible. The claim is not that circumstances don't matter at all. It's that a person's fundamental worth and fundamental capacity for meaning does not rise and fall with those circumstances the way most people instinctively assume it does, and that even within genuinely difficult circumstances, the space for judgment, for choosing how to interpret and respond to what's happening, remains real and remains yours. There's a final, very ordinary test case worth walking through, because it's one of the few situations almost everyone faces regularly enough to practice on. Being stuck waiting, whether in traffic, in a line, or for a response that hasn't come yet. Waiting on its own, described as neutrally as possible, is simply a period of time in which a desired outcome has not yet arrived. That's the entire content of the event. And yet most people experience waiting as something closer to active suffering, a state of agitation that seems to demand escape, distraction, or complaint. Notice, once again, how much of that agitation is being generated by judgment rather than by the waiting itself. The traffic is not personally targeting you. The line is not evidence of some cosmic unfairness, specifically directed at your day. The unanswered message does not, on its own, contain any information about whether the person on the other end still values you. What produces a felt sense of suffering in each of these cases is a layer of added interpretation. This shouldn't be happening. This is wasting my time. This means something bad, none of which is directly supported by the raw fact of waiting itself. Marcus Aurelius wrote, in one of his private reminders to himself, about the usefulness of expecting friction and delay as a normal, unremarkable part of any ordinary day, rather than as a special insult reserved just for him. This wasn't resignation. It was a deliberate recalibration of expectation, designed specifically to prevent the added layer of "this shouldn't be happening" from attaching itself automatically to every minor inconvenience life was always going to include. Practiced consistently, this recalibration doesn't make traffic move faster or lines move shorter. It simply removes an entire layer of unnecessary suffering that was never actually required by the traffic or the line in the first place, leaving only the original, much smaller, and far more manageable fact. Right now, you are waiting. If there's a single place to actually begin applying this idea, rather than simply admiring it as an interesting piece of ancient philosophy, it's in the smallest, least dramatic moments of an ordinary day, precisely because those moments are low stakes enough to practice on without the added pressure of a genuine crisis. The next time you feel a flash of irritation, disappointment, or hurt over something relatively minor, a delayed reply, a canceled plan, an offhand comment, try asking a very specific question rather than simply riding the feeling wherever it wants to take you. What actually happened? Describe as plainly as possible, and what am I adding to that description that is my own interpretation rather than a fact? This question, asked honestly and repeatedly, in small moments, is the entire practice. It doesn't produce indifference to life. It produces, slowly, with repetition, something closer to what the Stoics were actually after: the capacity to feel the genuine weight of difficult things without automatically compounding that weight with additional, self-generated suffering that was never actually required by the facts of the situation in the first place. The events of your life will keep happening, largely outside your control, exactly as they always have. What becomes available, with enough honest practice, is a measure of control over the one thing that was always actually yours to begin with: the judgment you bring to meet them.